In the mid-19th century, when China remained largely closed to the gospel and foreign missionaries were confined to a handful of coastal cities, one Englishman would dare to believe that God could open the vast interior of the world's most populous nation to Christianity. Hudson Taylor's story is not just the tale of one man's extraordinary faith, but a blueprint for a missionary movement that would transform how the church understood dependence on God, cultural adaptation, and the power of prevailing prayer. James Hudson Taylor was born on May 21, 1832, into a praying family that spoke often of other countries, particularly China. His father, James Taylor, was a pharmacist and a local Methodist preacher who had an unusual burden for the salvation of the Chinese people. Before Hudson was even born, his father prayed a prayer that would prove prophetic. "Dear God, if you should give us a son, grant that he may work for you in China." When their child was born, James and Amelia called him James Hudson Taylor, with Hudson being his mother's maiden name. Immersed in a Methodist family fascinated with China, young Hudson grew up hearing stories of the millions of Chinese people who had never heard the name of Jesus. Born in Barnsley, Yorkshire, on May 21, 1832, into a pious Methodist home, the religious fervor of his parents and their prayerful interest in China implanted in their firstborn the seed of foreign missions. Feeble health in childhood instilled in Taylor a sense that his life was not his own, and thus, from an early age, he professed a genuine desire for holiness. Yet, like many children raised in devout Christian homes, Hudson went through a period of rebellion during his teenage years. The faith of his parents had not yet become his own, and he drifted away from the spiritual foundations they had worked so hard to establish in his life. The turning point came when Hudson was 17 years old. Hudson Taylor experienced a transformative conversion at the age of 17 after reading a gospel tract. He came to understand the concept of Christ's finished work and surrendered himself fully to God's free gift of salvation. The story of his conversion is one of the most remarkable examples of the power of prayer in Christian history. Unbeknown to him, at that very moment his mother was kneeling in prayer, pleading with God for his salvation. She had gone to visit her sister in Barton-upon-Humber, some 50 miles away, and that afternoon had found herself with little to do. After noon dinner, she went to her room, where she felt an overwhelming burden to pray for her son's salvation. She locked the door and determined not to leave until she had the assurance that God had answered her prayer. At that exact moment, miles away, Hudson had wandered into his father's library looking for something to read. He picked up a gospel tract almost carelessly, thinking it might provide some entertainment. As he began to read, the words seemed to burn into his heart. The message was about the finished work of Christ on the cross. Hudson suddenly understood that Jesus had already done everything necessary for his salvation. There was nothing he needed to add, nothing he needed to accomplish. All he needed to do was accept by faith what Christ had already completed. In that moment, everything changed. When Hudson rushed home to tell his mother about his conversion, she simply smiled and said she already knew. She had been praying for him at that very hour, and God had given her the assurance that her prayers had been answered. From that moment forward, Hudson's life had a singular focus: preparing himself for missionary service in China. He began studying Mandarin Chinese on his own, disciplining himself through rigorous physical and spiritual training, and learning to live by faith in ways that would prepare him for the challenges ahead. In 1852, he began studying medicine at the London Hospital Medical College in Whitechapel, London, as preparation for working in China. He was baptized by Andrew John Jukes of the Plymouth Brethren in the Hull Brethren Assembly in 1852, and convinced his sister Amelia to also take adult baptism. At the age of 21, Hudson sailed for China aboard the Dumfries as an agent of the Chinese Evangelization Society on September 19, 1853 in Liverpool, Lancashire, England. The Dumfries arrived on March 1, 1854 in Shanghai, China. What he found there both thrilled and frustrated him. The handful of Protestant missionaries in China were almost entirely confined to the treaty ports along the coast. The vast interior of China, with its hundreds of millions of souls, remained virtually untouched by the gospel. The missionaries he encountered seemed more concerned with maintaining their European lifestyle and comfort than with reaching the lost Chinese people. From the beginning, he felt compelled to immerse himself deeply in Chinese culture, language, and traditions. Unlike many missionaries who clung to Western customs, Taylor adopted Chinese dress, learned the language, and sought to live among the people he served. He adopted Chinese dress and hairstyle, as well as learning the language and customs. His willingness to identify with the local culture communicated deep respect for the people he sought to reach. This radical approach shocked his fellow missionaries and scandalized many of the European residents in China, but it opened doors for Hudson that remained closed to those who insisted on maintaining their foreign identity. The years that followed were marked by both extraordinary breakthroughs and devastating setbacks. Hudson married Maria Dyer, the daughter of missionaries, and together they began venturing into regions where no Western missionary had ever gone. They faced disease, violence, political upheaval, and the constant challenge of survival in a culture that was often hostile to foreigners and to Christianity. Hudson and his wives. He later married Jenny Faulding after Maria passed away, lived apart for the sake of the gospel at times when necessary. The burden for inland China grew heavier with each passing year. Hudson calculated that approximately 1 million Chinese people were dying every month without ever having heard the gospel. The weight of this reality pressed on him relentlessly. In China, while stressing the need to preach widely, Hudson Taylor urged local churches to establish and mature, for church buildings to be of Chinese, not foreign design, and for leaders of the churches to be Chinese Christians. His burden for the still unreached areas pressed him further. In 1865, during a period of illness and discouragement, Hudson made a decision that would change the course of modern missions. Taylor decided to start a mission agency for work in the unreached interior provinces of China. In 1865, Taylor decided to start a mission agency for work in the unreached interior provinces of China. Missionaries with the China Inland Mission would adopt Chinese dress and would not receive a salary. This practice eventually became known as faith missions. The principles upon which the China Inland Mission was founded were revolutionary and would influence missionary work for generations to come. The impact of the China Inland Mission was staggering. It has been said at least 35,000 were his own converts, and that he baptized some 50,000. His gift for inspiring people to give themselves and their possessions to Christ was amazing. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Hudson's influence extended far beyond those he personally reached. The missionaries he trained and sent out established churches throughout inland China, translated the scriptures into numerous Chinese dialects, established schools and hospitals, and laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most significant Christian movements in world history. Hudson Taylor's faith-based approach to mission work, relying on God for support and adapting to the local culture, influenced later generations of missionaries. His emphasis on depending entirely on God for financial provision without making appeals or going into debt became the model for what became known as faith missions. Dozens of other missionary organizations would adopt the principles Hudson pioneered, spreading his influence to mission fields around the world. The personal cost of Hudson's commitment was enormous. He buried his wife Maria and 4 of his children in China. He suffered from chronic health problems that would have sidelined most people. He endured criticism from fellow missionaries who thought his methods were too radical, and opposition from Chinese authorities who viewed all foreigners with suspicion. Yet through it all, Hudson maintained an unshakable confidence in God's faithfulness and a burning passion to see the Chinese people come to know Christ. One of Hudson's most often quoted statements captures the essence of his missionary philosophy. The Great Commission is not an option to be considered, it is a command to be obeyed. This conviction drove everything he did. He refused to accept excuses for why the gospel could not be preached in inland China. He rejected the notion that certain people were too difficult to reach or that some cultures were too resistant to Christianity. He simply believed that God had commanded his followers to make disciples of all nations, and that faith and obedience were the only appropriate responses to that command. Hudson Taylor was known for his belief in prayer. He founded the China Inland Mission with a reliance on prayer for financial support and spiritual guidance. His life was characterized by what he called prevailing prayer, the kind of persistent, faith-filled intercession that refuses to give up until it sees God's answer. The remarkable stories of supernatural provision, miraculous protection, and divine guidance that marked his ministry were all attributed to prayer. Hudson taught his missionaries that their first and most important work was not preaching or teaching or medical care, but prayer. Everything else flowed from communion with God. Hudson Taylor died on June 3, 1905, but his legacy continues to shape missionary work around the world. The principles he pioneered, living by faith, identifying with local culture, empowering indigenous leadership, and maintaining an unwavering focus on unreached peoples, have become standard practices in modern missions. The man who had been told his frail health would never allow him to survive in China had given over 50 years of his life to the Chinese people and established a missionary movement that would touch millions of lives. The story of Hudson Taylor teaches us that God delights in using weak vessels to accomplish his mighty purposes. Hudson's physical weakness, his lack of formal theological training, his youth and inexperience when he first arrived in China, all these things that seemed like liabilities became assets in God's hands. They kept him dependent on divine strength rather than human ability, humble rather than proud, and constantly aware that any success in his ministry was God's doing, not his own. Perhaps most importantly, Hudson Taylor's life demonstrates the power of obedient faith. He did not wait until conditions were perfect or until he had all the resources he needed. He simply believed that God had called him, trusted that God would provide, and stepped out in obedience. That pattern of faith and obedience, repeated thousands of times over the course of his life, resulted in a legacy that continues to bear fruit more than a century after his death. The frail boy from Yorkshire whose father prayed he would work for God in China became one of the most influential missionaries in Christian history, proving once again that with God nothing is impossible for those who dare to believe and obey.